David Card, profesor de Economía en la Universidad de California, Berkeley, y director del Programa de Estudios Laborales en el Buró Nacional de Investigación Económica, NBER por sus siglas en inglés. Sus principales áreas de interés son inmigración, salarios, educación y diferencias por género y raza vinculadas al mercado laboral. Ha publicado alrededor de 125 artículos y capítulos de libros. David Card fue coeditor de Econométrica y de American Economic Review. En 1995 recibió la medalla John Bates Clark, otorgada por la Asociación Americana de Economía. También recibió el Premio de Economía Laboral del Instituto de Economía Laboral, ISA, en 2006, la medalla Frisch, otorgada por la Sociedad de Econometría, en 2007, y el Premio Fundación BBVA, Fronteras del Conocimiento, en 2015. Es doctor en Economía por la Universidad de Princeton.
Invito al Dr. David Card que pase al estrado para dictarnos su conferencia Model-Based versus Design-Based, The Evolution of Economic Methods. Un aplauso, por favor.
Thank you very much. I apologize for my presentation is going to be in English. My Spanish is missing. And even though I took many years of French, it's pretty bad too. So it may be better that I don't know any Spanish. So I'm going to give a kind of an address about a general topic rather than about human capital issues. And this is kind of an overview of what I see as a ongoing evolution of the way that research is done especially in the field of labor economics, but in the related fields like public economics and development economics. So nowadays in English, you refer to these fields together as empirical micro. And that includes the fields like labor economics and public economics, as well as other fields. And that style of research and the way that things are done in empirical micro has had a fairly important impact on the way economics is taught and talked about in say in the US and other developed countries. So at the undergraduate level, for instance, when I was an undergraduate, the econometrics was mostly about time series methods. And that was the evidence that was available. And nowadays, of course, most people would have seen, say, Angrist and Pischke's book and used approaches, or even Stock and Watson are using approaches which are much more related to microdata. At the graduate level, most graduate students in many of the top programs these days are doing empirical research with microdata. And there's, as a result of this sort of approach, that's really changed, for example, the field of development economics. Again, in the 1970s and 80s, development economics was some combination of macro and theory. And it really has changed. And just last week, Esther Duflo and Michael Kramer and Abhijit Banerjee won the Nobel Prize for their research, which is essentially experimental design-based research on innovations at the very micro level in poor countries. More fundamentally, probably if you're just an economist, it's also changed the way that people think about what economists do. So historically, if you were an economist and you met someone and you said you were an economist, they'd ask you what was going to happen to interest rates. And I must admit, I never knew what to say about that. I still don't know what to say about that, but it is true now that, for instance, if you read the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or Washington Post, you'll see a lot of research about it that economists are doing that's talked about that isn't really about interest rates or inflation. It's really about social interactions and people behavior, which is really what the topic is of empirical micro. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give a little background on how I think we kind of came to do this style of research in a large chunk of the profession. This is what I call design-based research. I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that have been picked up by economists, and actually I think outside of economics as well. Political science, for example, and sociology have been influenced by these works. And then I'll talk about the alternative approach, which is still very important in economics, which is what I call a model-based approach, which is where rather than start with a research design, you start with an economic model. And so I call that the model-based approach. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I see things going in the future. So there's some background issues I want to talk about to set the stage for this. One important background issue is the issue of causality. So most applied microeconomic research, empirical micro research, is based on the idea of trying to distinguish a causal effect of some intervention or change on some kind of outcome. And for example, if someone goes into a training program, 3 years later, are they earning more money than if they didn't go to a training program? That would be the kind of classic example. And there's quite a big debate inside of economics and also in philosophy and all kinds of fields. And it's about whether you can discuss and talk about causality in the absence of a model. And there's two extremes. One extreme would be, Jim Heckman has a couple of papers where he basically says, following up on, this is a sort of a philosophical position, that you can't really have causality in the absence of a model. So you have to have a model to speak of causality. The opposite view, statistician Holland has basically proposed a complete opposite view, which is causality is design-based. In other words, you can't claim to have causality unless you can propose a manipulation of some variable that then you can trace through to see how it affects other variables. And so those two opposing views are, at the end of the day, very strongly related to one's opinions about design-based versus model-based research. And to tell you the truth, I've read some of these papers and the underlying literature a number of times, and I don't get it. It's President Obama used to say, it's above my pay grade. They're talking about stuff that I don't understand. So I'm going to show you those two views, but I don't really have an opinion on which of those is right. It seems like both of those are somewhat extreme. For example, Holland's view says you can't really tell whether gravity causes the Earth to move around the sun because we couldn't really propose a manipulation of that. So Holland's view kind of rules out the entire field of astrophysics. So a second issue, background issue that I want to talk about is working models. So economic studies always have a working model. And at first you might say, well, when I read a paper, certain papers, a lot of papers that I've written or other people have written, there's no real model presented. But that isn't quite true. Almost always, if you read these papers, you get a sense that immediately there's some very specific delineation of whose behavior is being modeled. So you're talking about individual workers, or you're talking about individual firms, or maybe you're talking about government agencies in political economy. Implicitly, you're talking about what constraints they face. So you don't, if for example, a lot of studies will talk about immediate constraints in the period of analysis rather than intertemporal constraints. Other studies will talk about the intertemporal constraints. There's often a very clear delineation of what are the endogenous choice variables and what else is being taken as part of the constraint set. So all of those things are at least informally being delineated in the first part of a paper. And so it's not true that a design-based paper has no model. It has a sort of working model, which is maybe informally laid out, but is laying out most of these issues. And I always explain to my graduate students, because they've seen it before, but they haven't really thought about it, that if you have a successful working model, and even if it's informal, what it does is it shuts down a lot of questions which are really beyond the scope of today's talk. So if you say, I'm talking about training programs, I'm using a 3-year time horizon, I've got people that I've been able to follow from 2010 to 2015. Instantly, people sort of say, okay, well, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, how do training programs affect decision of somebody to drop out of school beforehand, which they could well do, but this is kind of the way that you rule out questions from left field by having a successful model. Now, with that said, there's a wide debate among economists about what is actually a legitimate working model. So outside of the fields of empirical micro, the models that people use are, in the last 30 years, have become more and more complex. Most of those models would have three elements that are largely missing from lots of informal working models. They would have imperfect information, they would have dynamics, and then they would have some element of general equilibrium. So if you think about, or at least a partial equilibrium. So if you think about macro, for instance, that's inevitably the case. Any useful model in macro, from perspective of many macroeconomists, has to have all of those elements. And I'm going to come back and talk about this in a minute. In my view, there's three types of working models in economics, and it's helpful to think about how they're different and how they're the same. The first kind is the kind that I was taught as an undergraduate, and it was really widely taught until the 1980s or even 1990s in economics. And that's a model where you have a simple specification of some outcome variables related to some underlying causal variables. And oftentimes there'll be a utility function or a budget constraint or a production function. But what's missing from that model is any discussion of why the model is not perfectly 100% correct. In other words, those models have a theoretical derivation, and then somehow we go from that theoretical derivation to some kind of regression model. And so what's missing from these models is any discussion of where the errors are coming from. Why is the model not 100% right? Okay? And if you read the famous papers from the Coles Commission, they're the guys that laid out modern econometric methods, two-stage least squares, limited information maximum likelihood, full information maximum likelihood in the 50s. This is what they did. They had in their minds a f of x function and a y function, and then some error somehow got added in. And no one really explained where the error comes from. Now, macro is a really good example of that, okay? Because if you think about macro for a minute, you say, okay, I've got many, many agents, and they're all doing exactly the same thing. There won't be any error, because the law of large numbers says that everybody's going to behave perfectly. So this is really a typical problem of the 1950s and 60s macro. Now, Hal White in 1980 said, well, maybe one way to think about error is a specification error, and that's one possible choice. Another is people informally speak of measurement errors or noise in the data. And in this class of, if you start with this class of model, you're often trying to measure test these general predictions. So a classic example in the 1980s, Angus Deaton wrote a paper that won the Frisch Prize, trying to talk about testing hypotheses that are the predictions that come from neoclassical demand theory, which is that the Slutsky matrix of a demand function is symmetric and negative semi-definite. And there's still a little bit of research in that, but that was a hot topic in the 1980s when I was a grad student. That was like state of the art. What we're going to do is we know that's true, and we kind of estimate some models. Now, more modern approach really originates with Dan McFadden's very clever paper, where he figured out, back in the 50s and 1960s, people knew about logit models. Actually, from the 1940s, people knew about logit models, but they didn't have a way to think about what the error term was. What's the logistic error? And what McFadden figured out, he reverse engineered that and figured out that if you have a utility function for each of the choices with an extreme value type 1 error, then you get logit choice models. And that was at the time, it's not, I defy you to find the paper where this is proved. It's actually like impossible to find on the internet, because it was really like not considered it was kind of a cool thing, but no one did much about it. But what it does is it says, it transforms the economic model into a complete DGP, a data generating process. So it says that apart from the things that I'm modeling, the X's and the betas, the error term represents unobserved taste heterogeneity. And that was an idea that had been going around from the 60s, this idea of random utility. They called it random utility. It meant that people had different choices because they had partly different X variables, prices and things like that they were facing, but partly because they had different tastes. And so the original derivation in McFadden's model is this is a taste heterogeneity parameter. And the reason why this is important and why it's been followed up so much in fields like IO is that this, if you actually know this model can be used to forecast out of sample. And people are familiar with this from, for example, McFadden's Nobel lecture points out that when they had estimated this model, a graduate student had done some work on this, estimating the impacts of opening up the BART, the big subway system in San Francisco area. And based on that, before they had actually estimated, before the BART was present, they could estimate how many passengers would take the BART. Okay? Now that's not something you can do in a design-based approach. You can't estimate the effect of something that doesn't exist. But a lot of economists think that that's an important thing to be able to do. And lots of times in government, for instance, you're asked, what would happen if we did the following policy? And no one has ever done that before. So in order to do that, you need this kind of model. You need what I call an all causes model. And then there's a third type of working model, and this is the kind of working model that's in a lot of papers in program evaluation literature, where there isn't a model. There's only some single equation which says, this is the thing I'm estimating. It represents some kind of counterfactual outcomes and in different states. And so what you're trying to do in that class of models is estimate a structural outcome equation. And you can't, the obvious disadvantage of this, and I think lots of people have thought about this in different contexts, is once you've estimated that, there's only so much you can do. You can't easily extend to say what would happen if you were outside of that context. You can sort of ex post analyze how a given program worked, but you can't extrapolate. And this approach has become very widely used to study not just market phenomena, but non-market phenomena because of its appeal. So how did we get to have this design-based research based oftentimes on implicit working models? Well, one important thing that is still, because I'm so old, I remember all of this, but when I was in graduate school in the 1970s, it was perceived that there was actually a huge crisis in econometrics. That's how they called it a crisis in econometrics, even though it was really a crisis in kind of methodology of research, not by econometricians, but by applied researchers using econometric tools. First example of that many people were aware of was Robert Lucas criticizing the large macro models that were being developed and estimated as not being able to give any insights into the changes that had caused there to be both inflation and unemployment simultaneously in the 1970s. And one interpretation of what Lucas was saying is that people had been working on models that weren't all causes models, that had a full enough description that they could forecast not just the current situation, but outside the current situation. Then in 1980, David Hendry, who had just got a chair at the LSE, wrote a kind of an interesting article. It's, this is a long, long time ago, but it's basically called Alchemy or Science, in which he was criticizing econometric methods and saying that most of the econometric results that you saw in published papers were basically garbage. Ed Leamer in 1983 basically said the same thing. And to tell you the honest truth, I don't think anybody disagreed with that strongly. So when I was a grad student, we would be reading papers in labor economics. This is like 1979, 80. We'd be reading papers in labor economics, and we'd read the first section, but no one read the tables. There was no point in reading the tables. No one actually thought about reading the results. That wasn't really the important point of the paper. The paper, although it was empirical and there were estimations, no one thought of the estimations as something to be taken seriously. Once in a while, somebody had a paper where someone thought these results would be actually quite credible and useful, but it was extremely widespread for people to just stop reading after they got to the empirical section. So that was just the state of play. And there was a bunch of other studies, maybe one that people kind of vaguely would know about. Bob Lalonde was my first PhD student. Orly Ashenfeller and I were his joint advisors. And Bob basically took an experiment that had been done evaluating programs, training programs for disadvantaged people in the United States, and applied some of the state-of-the-art econometric methods without using the experimental control, and said, to what extent are the experimental methods, non-experimental methods working? And basically said, well, they might work, they might not. It was very hard to tell. And so there's a lot of danger in using an econometric method with the kind of state of knowledge that we have. So what happened then over the next 20 years was a kind of a emergence of responses to that crisis. That's my interpretation of how this came about. So in labor economics, what happened was people started to actually try and do empirical research, which maybe would be more reliable, or nowadays people say they use the word credible, which maybe is a loaded word because, you know, the opposite of credible is incredible. And incredible is one of those English words which has two meanings. You can either be incredibly good or you can be incredible. So I'm always reluctant to use the word credible. Anyway, so we had Josh Angrist, for instance, use the draft lottery. He was building on a paper in the health economics literature, which had first used the draft lottery to look at suicide of Vietnam-era veterans. I did a paper on the Mariel boat lift. Alan Kruger and I did the minimum wage study in New Jersey. People then in the 1990s developed really rediscovered regression discontinuity, which is a pretty interesting methodology, had a lot of impact. David Lee basically realized that a close election is in some ways a perfect RD because you've got a really sharp outcome. You got one side or the other wins an election, but you can be often a few votes apart. And so that's a nice design. And outside of labor economics, these ideas really caught on, and there's been a kind of an explosion, as I mentioned before, in development economics, for instance, just an explosion of field experiments that in a good chunk of development economists really do spend almost all their time in that line of stuff. So what are some of the insights from this approach? Well, one of the insights from this is the idea of counterfactuals and research design. Now, I have to say, this is something you can't really imagine being true if you're younger, but in 1991, I believe it was, Alan Kruger was my office mate in Princeton, and Alan subscribed to the New England Journal of Medicine because maybe this was 1989. So Alan got a subscription, and we had and it comes in every week. Okay, and there's thousands of papers, and every paper, empirical paper in the New England Journal, is the same. It has a first section that says question, research design, results in the abstract. That's what the abstract has to say. At that time, no one used the word research. I said to Alan, what is a research design? Do we have that? I don't even know so no one used that word. That was like something that was not a standard idea in economics at all. And so to read these papers, nowadays, if you think about like a lot of economics papers would fit right in. And in fact, economists are publishing a lot of papers in medical journals because we finally do stuff that they can understand. So anyway, what's associated with that is the adoption of the Rubin, really Neyman-Rubin causal model, which sort of says there's an outcome equation under two states of the world or potentially multiple states of the world, and you're trying to model the differences between those carefully. And at the same time, and this is somewhat important, the word identification. In the old Coles Commission literature, the identification was essentially you've got a likelihood function, can you invert it and get parameters that you're interested in? So it was about the degree of curvature of a likelihood function. If your likelihood function was flat, you weren't identified. In this approach, identification is the same thing as the research design. The design creates a certain type of identification. And Angrist and Imbens formalized that in their famous late paper. They said, okay, what are you estimating when you do two-stage least squares with a simple Rubin causal model and a very simple outcome model? A second thing that's related to that is this widespread adoption of the idea that we should have a lot more focus in a paper on specification testing. And I call it substantive specification testing, because specification testing that is actually about, does the design make sense, not just like, is there some errors in the way the likelihood fits. So you have a lot of pre-treatment comparisons, falsification exercises, a lot of issues about balancing. People talk incessantly about the balance of the treatment group and the control group prior. And there's a kind of a hierarchy that's emerged that randomized design is better than an RD, regression discontinuity, is better than IV with a balanced design, which is better than an event study, which is better than difference to differences, which is better than OLS. And this is, you might not have ever thought about this before, but actually the Institute of Education Sciences in the US, when they evaluate research, that's a hierarchy. And they won't fund anything ahead of event study. Basically, if it's DD or OLS, you're not going to get funded. So you get more points if you're randomized, and more points if you're regression discontinuity. Another thing related to that is this emphasis on pre-specified designs and replicability. There was a lot of recognition, and still, I think people kind of know this. A lot of papers are not completely replicable, and there's two senses of replicable. One is that you can get the data that they did and run their model and get their coefficients. Now, actually, a surprising number of papers fail on that basis. And it's always kind of disappointing when you find out that, some paper that everyone was talking about, somebody got the data, ran what appeared to be the same model, and didn't get the same estimates. And so that's very disappointing. I think there's less of that going on. But what's going on more is what you call a real replication. So recently in psychology, there was an attempt to redo a bunch of famous psychology experiments, and a huge number of them don't really pan out. So you try and do exactly the protocol, and you don't get the same answer. And that's a different kind of replication failure. That's a failure where you might have had one design, and you think about using the same design in 10 different settings, okay? One time out of 10 or one time out of 20, the results will be statistically significant, and there's a concern that those are the ones we see. The 19 out of 20 that aren't statistically significant get thrown in the trash, and we only see the 1 out of 20. And so there's some element of that. In economics, there isn't really a big reward for replication. In fact, I've had a large number of PhD students who did replication studies, and I think every single one of them would tell you that a bad idea is to replicate some famous paper, because people really don't like it when you replicate their paper and find out that it's not 100% correct. So there is a movement toward pre-specified designs. The AEA will register your design, even if it's non-experimental. It's somewhat hard to write the protocol, but you can do it. That's something that's in the background. And then a final point I would make is I think there's kind of a debate in economists, and Angus Deaton is an old friend of mine. Actually, one of my, I met him in 1980 when I was a grad student. And he has a bunch of papers criticizing the use of field experiments in development economics. And one of the criticisms that he has is that randomized designs are not necessarily an efficient thing to do if you have strong prior knowledge. And this is actually a debate that goes back to the debate between Fisher, who founded sort of the idea of randomized design, and Student. Student was actually the statistical quality control agent at the Guinness Brewery in Ireland. I don't know if people know that. So his name wasn't Student, it was some Irish name. But he was actually quite a good statistician. And he's the guy that invented the t-distribution. So Student and Fisher had a big debate. And Student, having worked in the brewery all his life, thought, okay, we know a lot about how to make beer, and we know how it's going to get screwed up. So this idea of we would never do randomized experiments in the brewery. We're not going to do that. What we might do is we might run, one batch of malt this way and one batch of malt the other way, that kind of thing. So he was kind of saying that if you have prior designs, you don't want to do a randomization. But the problem is that in economics, I think we often lack that kind of knowledge. It's not like when we're modeling the labor market, especially complicated labor markets like exist in countries like Mexico with a formal sector and informal sector, a lot of transitions between, lots of problems of measurement and so on. So another thing that's happened in the last 20 years is a lot of these design-based studies, or even 30 years, a lot of these design-based studies don't get the right answer. So I kind of have been guilty of this many times myself. So when I did the Mariel Boatlift study, as far as I could tell, the inflow of immigrants to Miami, even though it was relatively large and highly unskilled, didn't have a big effect on other workers. And that was kind of the wrong answer. People did not want to hear that answer. And some people still don't want to hear it. The same thing with the minimum wage. Alan and I, we had done some other studies before, Alan Kruger, and when we kind of, one day there was a newspaper article about New Jersey was going to raise its minimum wage, and we thought, well, maybe we could try and answer this once and for all by doing this little study. And we basically got the wrong answer there too. So a lot of times you get if you do these design-based studies, you're not going to get the answer that everyone expects. Now, whether that's because on luck or whether it's because fundamentally the underlying mechanisms that people think they know are correct are not correct, that's a big debate. My view is that lots of times we think we know stuff that isn't true. But I think other people don't necessarily think that. So some of the tensions between the model-based and design-based approaches. One is the background factor that in macro, DSG models have become the working model. So macroeconomists have no idea what you're talking about if you don't have a model. So that's a very important thing. The same is sort of true in industrial organization, IO. In IO, basically, if you want to study antitrust, you've got to have a pretty complete model. If you want to study auctions, which a lot of IO economists work on, including some of my friends, you basically have to have a complete model, because otherwise there's nothing really you can say. You have to be able to invert the data. And so for those kind of analyses, you need to have a structural model. And so when they see a labor economist doing some kind of simple design-based analysis, they say, well, what is this? Why is this even a thing? A third thing that's gone on is developments in econometrics. So econometrics has actually made some progress relative to the 1980s. Mixed logit and extensions give rise to the BLP model. So that's a model where it's pretty straightforward to model consumer demand with a lot of heterogeneity, and it's still an all causes model. So it's still a model that you can generalize beyond the data you have. Related to that, Rust and Hodson Miller, basically Rust figured out that you could take the nested logit and make it intertemporal. My understanding is basically Dan McFadden said to him, do this. But anyway, so that's basically the dynamic programming models based on logit models are essentially nested logits. So that solves a lot of problems because those are easy to compute, and you can actually evaluate the inclusive value of a forward-looking model is just the Emax, which is the expected maximum that you're going to get if you go down a path, which is a very important part of a dynamic programming model. And then more recently, there's been a lot of interest in partial identification, which is a way to say, well, even if we've got a half-specified model, we can't fully specify it, we might still be able to learn something. So here's some of the key areas of disagreement. One is the completeness of the working model, and I've sort of alluded to this. So design-based papers often use very simplified models. Model-based papers often work from an assumed model. And it's kind of hard to see, sometimes it's kind of, you can get into sort of useless arguments between those two approaches because they seem to be very different. Here's an interesting comment. This is from Chris Sims commenting on Angerst and Pischke wrote a paper in the JEP, which was pretty far out there, sort of saying the only thing that you should do is model-based, design-based work. And sort of Sims got ticked off and said, well, by promoting single equation linear, single instrument modeling, focused on single parameters, they're helping create an environment which applied economists emerged from the PhD program, not knowing how to undertake deeper and more useful analysis of the data. In other words, if you're trained as a labor economist, you're a complete moron. So that's about as clear as you can get. Anyway, somewhat related to that, you'll hear the discussion, what are the parameters of interest? And what that is it's the same kind of question as we've been talking about before. It's a question of whether you're just trying to model the relationship between some y and some x as closely as you can with a research design, or are you trying to estimate the parameters of some potentially more complicated system which has a fully specified nature of x, y, and some error terms. And so that more complicated model, the G model down here, is really something like a complete model. The simple X beta model is an incomplete model. You can think about the Lucas critique is that the beta from the first model is really a changing parameter depending on the underlying thetas and the ratio, the way the epsilons are changing in the second model. So a lot of things can be nested in this very simple framework. So the discussion about the parameters of interest is really often a discussion about design versus model-based. Identification, design-based parameters, practitioners are talking about identification all the time. Model-based studies are identified by some combination of structure, assumptions, and oftentimes outside information, which makes a lot of sense in physics or chemistry, where you have a lot of outside information. You're not trying to model everything. You take some things as given. That's the calibration part of the analysis usually. And so if you're confident about the model, that makes a lot of sense. If you're not confident about the model, maybe it makes less sense. Another related question is just how confident are you in the working model? So, for example, in my view, what we've learned in the last 20 years is that the labor market works in a way that for a large fraction of workers, wages are set by employers with some degree of market power. Maybe a little bit, maybe a lot, but understanding market power in the labor market is as important as understanding market power in the product market. So that's my view. So that means if you start with that view, then you really have to think carefully about very, very simple supply and demand models of the labor market, because they're not quite correctly specified. So that's important, and I don't have a lot of confidence that a simple supply and demand model is correct. I think there's something missing from that model and will be incorrect. In program evaluations, oftentimes it's extremely important to understand, is something even going to work? That's really important in welfare reform or training program evaluations or trying out a new intervention in medicine, those kind of things, where you're actually trying to figure out, does something really work when it's actually implemented, not just necessarily in the lab, but sort of in the field. So that's a big difference. Topic choice is also quite important. So you'll notice, I think if you look at it, that the design-based approach is often practiced by people that are a little more open-minded about what economists should study. So it's okay to study behavioral issues, peer effects, happiness. And model-based practitioners tend to be more neoclassical, and they tend to want to study prices and incomes and quantities. So there's some differences there. Then finally, let me talk about going forward. So one of the big, one of the big criticisms of experiments, or experimental approaches, and this carries over to a lot of quasi-experimental or research design-based studies, is the question of generalizability. So the simplest design-based studies recover some average treatment effect or some local average treatment effect, and it's not entirely clear what you do with that. How do you use that for anything? So there's some new directions there, somewhat new directions. So Heckman and Wittlisel and a large number of later authors have pointed out that you can learn, even with a very straightforward research design, you can learn about the heterogeneity of responses through various approaches. Their approach, they call it marginal treatment effects. These are ways to mine the existing data that you get from a design and try and understand the heterogeneity of the responses. And that heterogeneity then could be extrapolated to other settings. So you could, for example, if you've got a local average treatment effect, you might be able to get some sense of what the average treatment effect would be if everyone was treated, or if you were treating a different subgroup for a different research design. Related to that, there's a lot of literature in the last few years about richer models of the counterfactuals. And one direction that's going, my colleagues Pat Klein and Chris Walters have an influential paper evaluating Head Start, which is a childcare program in the US. And what they pointed out with Head Start is that, in a way, the Head Start program got two counterfactuals. One is that the child stays at home with the mother, and the other is that the child goes to an alternative form of care besides Head Start, and then you've got Head Start. And so that doesn't sound like a complication that's that difficult, but actually fully understanding what happens when there's multiple counterfactuals can be quite insightful, because that allows you then to generalize in a different direction. It allows you to say, if we opened up these childcare programs in different settings, it would depend on where the people that go into this program are drawn from. Are they drawn from children who are at home and in the absence of the program would stay at home? Or are they drawn from children who are staying in other informal care and in the absence would stay in informal care? So that, Jack Mountjoy has a really nice paper, kind of a similar paper, looking at the differences between 2- and 4-year college. And 2-year colleges are interesting because they have two counterfactuals. people that go to 2-year or 3-year colleges in the US come from two places. They could be people who would have only gone to high school, and with this college present, they'll go to a little bit more college, and maybe that will be, for them, quite a positive thing. And there's always been a concern in the US that, on the other hand, some of the people who would go to a 4-year college might go to a 2-year college, and that might be, for them, potentially not as good an investment. So he has a very nice paper laying out the choices when you've got these two counterfactuals. And I see a lot of papers coming in the next few years that are going to be exploring things like that. Another area where we're basically following what goes on in fields that are really design-based all the time is meta-analysis. So in medicine, there's just dozens and dozens of meta-analyses, sometimes of the same experiment being conducted in different settings, so the drug trials or something like that. Other times, more complicated interventions, including now non-experimental interventions. So there's online collaborations. The Cochrane Collaborative is a thing that studies meta-analysis of experiments. And the Campbell Collaborative is this thing that studies meta-analyses of non-experimental research designs. And so you're seeing a lot of interest in, I've done a couple of papers trying to do things like this on minimum wages and active labor market programs, where if you put together a lot of studies, each of them has limitations, but you often know a lot about the study, the context and so on. So you might be able to extrapolate from that. And this is an example from a meta-analysis I did. These are the estimated treatment effects for a 1 to 2 year horizon. This is the percent change in earnings from each of these. Each red dot is a point estimate, and the blue line is the confidence interval. And you can see this is about 60 studies. You can see a very enormous heterogeneity. Some of the programs actually seem to hurt the people that are in the program. Some of the programs seem to have treatment effects that are way too big. So you can see that there's a lot of heterogeneity in existing literature. A third thing that's coming on, or another thing that's coming on, is ideas from statistical learning or machine learning literature. These kind of models are optimized to do forecasts. And at first, economists said, well, why do we care about forecasting? I mean, if we're not a macroeconomist, why do we care about forecasting? But then I think people have realized that actually forecasting is really useful. For example, instrumental variables, what is an instrument? It's a forecaster. So you can use machine learning ideas. Turner-Zukoff et al. Have got a couple of papers, influential papers, saying, well, we could maybe use machine learning ideas to help us develop better first-stage models with weak instruments. Similarly, a big concern in the machine learning literature is the problem of multiple testing. This is comes up because you might have what they call it, say at Amazon. Every night at Amazon, they're changing the stuff that they show people. Okay, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but you get on Amazon one time and things are in one order, and a few minutes later they're in a different order. That's because you're in an experiment. And it's an A-B, they're doing thousands of A-B experiment. A-B means the two sides of the experiment. They call them A-B experiments. So there's many, many thousands of these being run every night. Now the problem is, for Amazon, that they're going to get lots of statistically significant results, which are completely meaningless because they're kind of over mining the data. So they have to have ways to deal with the multiple testing. And my colleagues, Pat and Chris, have recently thought about these ideas for audit studies. So they're basically doing sequential audit studies where they send a bunch of resumes to firms and see what happens. And if it looks like there's something weird, they send a whole bunch more resumes to the same firm. So exactly the ideas that are used in this literature. A third thing that's really going on a lot in labor economics is the idea of really big data sets. So when people in the United States, all deans, I'm saying this is, deans are, that's their bosses, right? That's our bosses. All deans believe that big data, they don't know what big data is, but they believe that we should have courses in big data. And we should all be learning about big data. Okay, in economics, we have really big data, like all people, or all the tweets on Twitter forever, which is a very large number of data points. And so there's design-based approaches are complementary to that. So you'll see a lot of people, Raj Chetty, for example, is a good practitioner of this area, where they're digging around for very rare research designs that you couldn't find or estimate if you didn't have everybody in the whole population. So one problem with these big data sets is they're sparse. So tax data, for instance, you've got nothing. You don't know education. You don't know lots of things about people. So it's possible that in big data, there's also a lot of room for model-based work. I think that's exactly the same situation because there's so many missing pieces, which you might be able to partially fill in with machine learning techniques and then build in a model and try and work with. So I think that big data is an opportunity for both sets of approaches, actually. So finally, then, let me close. This is my last slide. I hope I'm doing okay for time. Am I doing okay? Yeah, okay. So in economics, I was a physics undergraduate. I would have been a terrible physicist. I would have probably been unemployed by now. But in physics, unlike physics, we don't have a standard model. Okay, so the standard model is like the most amazing accomplishment of human nature, of humankind in the 20th century. It's basically like an incredibly complicated model that describes the way much of the universe works. It's got problems. Everybody's probably heard of those problems. But if you don't go into physics and say, I've got a new idea, I'm going to run an experiment, people think you're nuts because they basically know a huge amount about what will work. And you really, 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 really have to know a lot to be able to make a contribution. And that's not really quite the same in economics. Maybe there's more of that in economics than some people acknowledge. I would say that this is Angus Deaton's view. His view is that we're not as hopelessly uninformed as a lot of field experimenters think we are. But in any case, as a result of that, a lot of basic premises in the working models that we have are either inherently incorrect or incorrect for a large fraction of people. So the standard working models have, for instance, intertemporally separable preferences. You basically have to have that to do anything with a model. They've usually got risk neutrality. Okay, so standard models have risk neutrality. On the other hand, most people who work in the risk area think that, von Neumann-Morgenstern doesn't really work very well. It's okay, but it, doesn't describe why everybody in Las Vegas has insurance on their car. It's going to be kind of hard to figure that out. So those kind of problems mean that the kind of models we have in economics are just not very good at describing the essential characteristics of every single person. They might describe broad trends, but they're really incomplete models. And so there's a huge amount that we're either going to have to put in the error term, or we're going to have to try and figure out some other way. So I think there's a lot of room in that setting without having good models of how people behave for multiple kinds of research. So both descriptive work that points to new facts, and in fact, if you look carefully at what's gone on and say the papers published in the QJE, the quarterly journal, the last couple of years, you'll see an amazing fraction of those papers are actually descriptive papers that talk about, what's happened to inequality or what's happened to tax rates or something like that. There's a lot of room to know how much does the rate of intergenerational mobility vary across regions in the United States. Okay, that's just a basic, simple descriptive question. Program evaluation research, so that's just, does this program work? Is it, for whom did it work? What can we learn from a program? There's a lot of research like that. Simple hypothesis testing so that's kind of thing that's often done in field experiments or quasi-experimental designs. If we raise the minimum wage, how many jobs will be lost? What will be the average increase in wages? What will be the effects 3 years later on people who had higher minimum wage? If you had a good design and really good data, that would still be an important paper. There's a really probably an important paper coming out in the QJ in the next year looking at the imposition of a high minimum wage in Germany on how that affected workers and firms and the reallocation of workers to firms and what was the net effect on employment. In all honesty, I would say that 85% of economists in Germany were completely off the mark because they all believed it was going to be the worst thing that ever happened, and it looks like it didn't quite work out the way they expected. So there's a lot to be learned because our standard working model isn't really complete or is poorly available. Now, there's also many situations where we need to fit models. That's not something I do that often, but it can be done. And I have a lot of appreciation for it. For example, if anyone works in the government, 99% of the time at the Council of Economic Advisors or the whatever, they actually have to make some kind of a model because somebody's asking them about something that doesn't exist or that exists in a very different format. So or they need to evaluate something like what would happen if we allowed this merger to go through versus if we didn't allow this merger to go through. Very important everyday problem, but that's a model-based problem. There's no way to really do that with a design. So I think that all these types of approaches have a complementary value in our field, and hopefully they'll all push forward in the next decade. So thanks very much.
We have a couple of questions, Professor Carr. The first one, do empirical studies have to be different in developing countries from those used in developed countries such as the US and the UK?
Not in principle, they should be different, but I think, so one thing I have a lot of graduates, I've had many graduate students, and one thing I tell graduate students if they're working on some problem is like, go and read what if the thing they're studying has been investigated by a journalist or an anthropologist or something, go and read what they said. Or if their mother or father is a doctor and they're working in health economics, go and talk to their mother. So economists have a little bit of arrogance. We think that we can understand stuff maybe with some abstract model that we learned in some journal. And I think that we would do better, and it's our necessity to try and develop our approaches. And that's true for design-based approaches as well as model-based approaches, that we should develop our approach based on recognizing what the situation really is. And some of the worst criticisms of development economics, I think, are that, some rich white kid from New York gets off the plane in Nairobi. They look around and say, this is screwed up, I'm gonna run an experiment. Okay, that kind of thing drives me a bit crazy because, there's a lot of issues that are very relevant for a particular context that people there would know about, and that it's our job to figure that out. So I think in any study, but especially developing country study, it's important that the research be developed and the approach be developed that takes account of the situation as closely as possible. There's no point in having papers that discuss abstract concepts that aren't relevant for the people that you're supposedly studying, in my view.
Thank you. Another question. From all the different types of models you discussed with us today, which one or which ones do you think have the greatest opportunity to do research in the future?
Well, I think I sort of laid it out here on this slide. I think they all have a value. It really depends partially on your interests or someone's interest and their aptitude, and partially the question that they're trying to follow. So I think that all these approaches, both anything from descriptive all the way to fully parametric, complicated model with multiple, elements, equilibrium, and so on. I think those would all could be useful. Yeah.
Thank you. Another one. What is your opinion about the push for a $15 increase in minimum wage?
I don't know if everybody knows this, but I never take opinions on normative issues. And that's always served me well. I don't think that's going to happen. Basically, to get a minimum wage, federal minimum wage passed, the Congress, the Senate, the House, the Senate, and the President all have to agree. Well, they can't agree on whether to allow the Treasury to issue more bonds next month. So this is I don't see that happening. So I'm not going to worry about making a prediction on that. Yeah, I think there's a concern. So my old friend Alan Kruger, who's passed away, but Alan, who's did a lot of research with me on minimum wage, wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe it was, and said maybe $15 minimum wage is too high for low wage parts of the United States. That there's no reason to think from the research that he knew about that was true. Now, people have reacted to Alan's study or Alan's point and tried to say, well, what has been the effect of the minimum wage when it was really high? But I haven't really fully reviewed that. But I try not to have opinions on things. It never works out.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the School of Economics, our students and teachers, we thank you very much for your conference. Thank you very much.